.NET Core has brought a lot of great benefits right into the .NET language. We get dependency injection, a much better configuration system, and we get common logging systems that are easy to use. The only problem is that mainly we only see these things set up for us in a web environment. What happens when we want to get these things running in a console application, for example? Well, it takes a bit more work, but it can be done. In this video, we're going to set up dependency injection, configuration using appsettings.json, and logging using Serilog in a console application. Now, if this is your first time watching one of my videos, welcome. My name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. Every Monday, I teach you something about C# code, and every Thursday, I work to answer your questions. We'd love to have you subscribe to the channel and join with us as you watch. Now, I take comments very seriously, so if you have questions or thoughts about C# code or want to know more about a certain topic, leave that down in the comments below. I will read it. I will get to it. It's taking a little bit longer to get to comments just because there's so many of them now. But I am working very hard to get to all the comments and at least read through and write down any suggestions and put it on a list. And then what I do is I look at my list and say, what do people need? And then based upon that, I create a video for it. This video is an example of that. I've had numerous people say, dependency injection is great in .NET Core, but what about console apps that are .NET Core? So if you have thoughts, leave them down below and I'll add it to the list. Either way, thanks for joining us. All right, let's get started in Visual Studio. We're going to create a new project. I'm using Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition. That's the one I installed when I reinstalled my PC, and we walked through that process. So that's what I'm using. So it should be about the same as what you're using right now. So console app for .NET Core. This is important because there is also a .NET Framework version of the console application. We want .NET Core version. Notice this runs on not only Windows, but also Linux and Mac. Let's call this console UI, and we're going to call this better console app for the solution name. And we'll hit create. So it's going to create for us our project and solution. That's a .NET Core console application. Now, right out of the gate, you get what's pretty similar to what we are used to in .NET Framework, which is just a static void main, and then you can write whatever code you want in here. And typically, if we're honest, most of us put all of our code between these two curly braces and don't put code anywhere else because that's just kind of how we do things. But we really want to go a little bit beyond that and say, yes, this is a full application. Let's treat it as such, and let's make sure that we're writing applications that are easier to maintain, easier to upgrade and improve without redoing the entire application. So let's add things like dependency injection and logging and a configuration file we can change at runtime. So the place to start here is in NuGet. So right click on dependencies and manage NuGet packages. We're going to browse here and we're going to look for Microsoft.extensions.hosting. That's this one right here. This we want to set up our hosting environment. So we hit install here and we hit OK. I know the fonts mess this up a little bit, but it's saying, hey, we're going to make some changes to your solution. Is that okay? Yes, it is. And I accept the license agreement. So that's one. We're going to add a couple more, actually 3 more for Serilog. Now, if you're not familiar with Serilog, what this is it is an alternative to the built-in hosting or logging system in .NET Core. And it's an alternative that I think is much, much better because it gives us a lot more options and flexibility. The built-in version of logging is really just the starting point. It's the place you kind of kick off from and say, okay, if you're just doing basic logging, this will work, but for anything else, you probably should add something different. And so Serilog is that something different. It allows us to log to a number of different platforms, whether it's SQL or whether it's text file or whether it's console or wherever. And today we're just going to do console just to show how it works. But Serilog is kind of like it's almost required if you're going to do any type of quote unquote real application. Now, the same is not necessarily true for the dependency injection system. I use the built-in .NET Core dependency injection system for even production apps. It's a little bit higher level, but if you want to replace that as well with something else like AutoFac or another one, you can do that just as easily. But for us today, we're just going to replace the logging system because that's a much more common thing to do. So we're going to first add serilog.extensions.hosting. So this is for .NET Core logging and hosted services. We hit OK and I accept. And we also want to have serilog.settings.configuration. And that's going to be to talk to the appsettings.json file to get its configuration. I much prefer this to hard coding my logging setup. So this is where we're going to put in appsettings.json the information about how to configure our logger. So let's install that. Let's check the box that don't show us again. Okay, and one last one, and this is serilog.syncs.console. And what this is, a Serilog sync is the place to log to. This is the location where you want to send your logs to. So in our case, we're going to send it to the console. There's also the colored console, meaning you could actually change colors for your logging, or to a file, or to a rolling file, application insights, Elasticsearch. There's so many different syncs. And that's one of the benefits of Serilog, is you're not limited to just a few different places to log to. You can log to pretty much anywhere. And so in our case, we're just going to choose console, but later on, you can add different sync in, and you're all set up basically. You're just ready to go to use that other sync and that other location as well for logging. So let's log to the console. And that's it. So those are our NuGet packages. Now I want to show you a little trick here. And this is new with .NET Core. It used to be that the csproj file, the project file for C#, was something you could not edit unless you were offline, meaning you had to right-click on the project and say unload project in order to edit the CS project file. But now you don't have to. And with that, we also get a much, much cleaner csproj file. It used to be you'd get, between 150 and 250 lines of text in your csproj file. Now we have a much, much cleaner csproj file. In fact, this is mine. It's 15 lines. Now, I just started a console application, so there isn't a ton anyways. But what this shows is this right here. I want to point this out. This is my installed NuGet packages. Notice item group package reference. A package reference means a NuGet package. So there's the packages I have installed. If you wanted to create a new console application and you want to bring those 4 packages in, you could just copy this group and go into the new csproj file, paste it in, and now it'll bring in those project files instead of you going to NuGet and manually entering those 4 references. So it's a neat little shortcut there, and one that makes it a lot easier to create projects that are very, very similar or the same starting point, even if you don't create a project template, which you could do. So just note that's there. So now we have our NuGet packages installed. Let's now add our appsettings.json file. Notice there is none currently because we don't have one for console apps by default. So right click on your project and say add, new item, and we're going to search for JSON, JSON, and choose a JSON file and just name this app settings. Notice it's plural there, and this name is important. So appsettings.json. I can give it an extension, but since I selected JSON as a file type, it gave it a .json by default. So appsettings.json, this is where we'll store all of our information. So the other thing to do here is right click on it and go to properties. And you want to set the copy to output directory. Notice this one right here. You want to set that to copy always or copy if newer. It's up to you which you do. I prefer to copy always just to make sure I have the latest version. And if I have an application that changes the appsettings.json, it's going to get overwritten every time I do a rebuild, so it's not confusing. So that's my preference, but you need to make sure you do that. If you miss that step, then you will not have an appsettings.json file to use when you're trying to run this application, and it may be confusing. All right, so we have 3 goals for this system. Let's put them up here. We want to use dependency injection, or DI. We want to use logging. Let's just say Serilog, because we want to use logging, but with Serilog. And finally, we want to use our settings. Okay, those are the 3 things that this console app needs to do. So let's start by hooking really all of these up together. There's not really a way to pull apart and say, okay, let's just hook up just this one thing and add more. I could have done that, but it would be a little more confusing than helpful. So I think we're just going to do it all at once, and then we'll talk through the different pieces. Okay, so let's start with this build config. So with logging, we want to log right away before we even set up dependency injection properly, before we even do anything else. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk to the appsettings.json before it gets set up in its natural occurrence. So we have to actually create a manual connection to appsettings.json. To do that, we're going to say static void, it's by default private, static void, we're going to say build config. And we'll pass in IAmTimCorey. All right. Now, notice when I did that, this is a newer feature in Visual Studio 2019. You may or may not notice it, but I didn't have this using statement here. But since it knows that I might have use of it, then it's kind of, IntelliSense has kind of kept that in the back of its mind saying, hey, you don't have this install or a using statement for this, but looks like you're looking for that. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that using statement. So it's kind of a really intelligent way of doing things. But just know I did add that using statement up here just by typing this out. So if yours doesn't do that, you might have to do a control dot and add it. I'll show you that right now. So if it's not here, and I say, let's call this builder. And it says, hey, you got something wrong here. If I hit control dot, it brings up my quick actions and refactoring. And the first one is a using statement for Microsoft.extensions.configuration. I click that, and it adds that using statement at the top. So that's the manual way of doing that if it didn't do it for you automatically. I really don't want to have magic in this. I'll make sure I point those things out. All right, so with this builder, we're going to pass in an IConfiguration builder. And this may be confusing. I understand that. We're going to explain all of this, but some of it has to be down in, on paper, but it's, in code. It has to be written before we can talk through what it does. Otherwise, it's just theory. And I don't like theory either. So let's just do this, and then we'll talk it through. So builder dot set base path to be directory dot get current directory. And again, that add the using system.io. Let's go to the next line, and we'll say dot add JSON file appsettings.json. And optional is false, and reload on change is true. Now we could stop right there. And what this would do is it's going to create or add to our builder the ability to talk to appsettings.json. Now, where is that appsettings.json? Well, it's saying, hey, wherever you're running Mr. EXE or Ms. EXE, look in that same directory. So the current directory where you're running, look for an appsettings.json and add that as your settings file. And that's not optional. And if the appsettings.json file changes, reload it. That's what that's doing. So that's creating a connection to our appsettings.json file. We could end it right there. But we do want to have this ability that we already have with appsettings.json files, which is to have an override for the development mode or for production mode or others. So let's add another JSON file called, let's start with a string interpolation, appsettings dot, and then our curly braces, environment dot get environment variable ASP.NET Core underscore environment. Make sure you spell it right. All right, I'm going to unpin this here. So, what's this doing? And we're not done yet, but what's this doing? Well, what it's doing is it's saying, I want you to get not just appsettings.json, but appsettings.development.json or appsettings.production.json. Whatever mode you're running in, I want you to get that environment set as well. Because with appsettings.json, you can override. And I'll be doing a video on this in the future. I've already covered it in some of my courses. But I want to do this for YouTube as well, where we talk about just how amazing appsettings.json is. You see, we used to have app.config or web.config. So for a console, we'd have an app.config file. And that was a place we could put all of our settings. But what if you have a connection string that is secure? What do you do with that? Well, you'd put it in a different file, and then you try to kind of inject it during build into your app.config file, which you usually use a tool like SlowCheetah to do that or something else. But you're still saving it in a file somewhere. It's a little messy. Well, now with appsettings.json, it's a whole lot easier. There's a whole hierarchy of different settings files that override each other, kind of like what CSS does, where depending on the order, one will override the other. So in this case, this is the starting point, appsettings.json. But if you have an appsettings. Let's say development.json file that is going to be different than appsettings.json, and you're in that environment, then it will override that setting. So in this case, we're going to say environmental variable, but if it doesn't exist, then use production as our default, and then put JSON at the end. So appsettings.development if we're in the development environment. But if we can't find what environment we're in, then default to the fact that we're in production. That's the assumption is if it doesn't specify it, it's production. And lastly, we want to also mark this optional equals true. Because what if you don't have that file? Which we don't have that right now. No problem. It's optional. If you don't find it, cool. Don't use it. But then you also want to add environmental variables. So if you have environmental variables, they can override what's in appsettings.json. So maybe you have an environment variable that overrides your connection string. So that on your PC, it's this connection string, but it's not like you put that into source control because the default one is a throwaway one or something like that. And yours locally is specific to your local machine. So that's why you might use an environmental variable. So this sets up our talking to a configuration source. All right. Now, like I said, this is going to happen before it normally happens in the setup process. And that's to allow us to do logging before we actually work with our configuration. Does that sound confusing? I hope not, but it probably does. And that's okay. We're going to get to it. So let's start in our static void main. Let's kind of highlight or minimize this just because we saw what the code does. Now let's just rely on BuildConfig. We're just going to call it that. So var builder equals new configuration, not binder, builder. So we're going to start off with a new configuration builder, which just happens to be an I configuration builder, which means we can say build config on our new builder. So we create a whole new configuration builder, and we've said, hey, you know what? Why don't you go ahead and add the appsettings.json stuff to it. All right. Now, I didn't get that builder back. I just pass it in. But remember, with objects in C#, we pass references. Now, with types like an integer or a Boolean, we're copying a value. But with types, with objects, we pass a reference to that instance. So whenever you do any work on builder, even if it's in BuildConfig, it's going to modify the builder for everybody. All right. So now that it's modified, we can set up our logging for Serilog. So log, notice it says over here Serilog. It's going to add a using statement at the very top. So I hit log dot. Notice now we have a Serilog reference up here. Log.logger equals new logging configuration. Logger configuration, sorry. That's why it wasn't showing up. Logger configuration. Now I am going to do a dot read from configuration builder.build. What it's doing is taking that builder and saying, okay, execute that builder, which means it's going to set it all up, which is going to give it connection to the appsettings.json file. And we're going to read the configuration from that resulting build. So it's going to be able to talk to the appsettings.json file now, plus the appsettings.developer.json or appsettings.production.json, plus the environmental variables. So the logger can now read the configuration from the appsettings.json file. We don't have any in there yet, but we will. All right. And that allows us to set up all our configuration for Serilog in our appsettings.json file. And I'm going to say dot enrich from log context. And that adds extra things from Serilog. So it gets more information. It says enriches from log events with properties from the serilog.context.log context. Okay, so that's going to add extra stuff to our logging. And then afterwards, I'm going to say write to .console. This is really nice how they've set this up because it reads very cleanly. We're going to read from the configuration. We're going to enrich it with log context. We're going to write it to the console. And then finally, we're going to say create logger. So that's our logger. That's how you set up Serilog. Is we first have to establish a connection to the configuration file if you're doing configuration setup for Serilog, and I do encourage that. And then we say, here's the setup work for our logger. So all that work so far was all about Serilog and to get our logging configured properly. And we're not quite done because we do have to set up some configuration in our appsettings.json file. But we'll get to that after we're finished in this file here. Now we're ready to actually set up our console to have dependency injection, logging, and talk to appsettings.json. Because even though we have this build config that talks to appsettings.json, that's kind of I don't want to say a hack, but it's almost, because that's doing it before the natural process of things. And we have to do it because we want to set the logging right away. Because we might actually want to say right here, log.logger.information, where we say application starting. Something like that. So it's going to log information saying, hey, we're starting the application now. So just note that that's what that's for. But now we're going to set up our actual way of doing dependency injection and all the rest. So var host equals host, so capital H host, dot create default builder. And this one's yelling at me. It's saying, no, that doesn't exist in the current context. So let's control dot on that and use the using Microsoft.extensions.hosting. So it didn't add the using statement up here that we needed for this because it wasn't sure what we were doing. It's okay. We can add that using statement. So now it's up here. And now we're all good. We're creating this default builder. Now, this is really cool. I really appreciate Microsoft doing this. People keep saying to me, oh, Microsoft documentation is so bad. And for so many years, that was so true. But it's getting a lot better. I mean, docs.microsoft.com actually reads like a book. It's great. And even in their code, they're getting a lot better. Instead of saying, what does the iLogger do? It logs stuff. There's a little more explanation than that. Well, create default builder. What does this do? Well, mouse over it. Here's what it does. Here's the following defaults that are applied. Sets the iHost environment content root path to the result of directory.getCurrent directory. It sets the iConfiguration with the .NET _ prefix environmental variables, then the iConfiguration from appsettings.json, look familiar, and appsettings.environment or iHost environment.environment name, which would be development or production. So appsettings.development.json. And then it also loads iConfiguration from user secrets when iHost environment.environment name is development using the entry assembly. And it loads the iConfiguration from environmental variables. So it's setting up our hierarchy, our default hierarchy for iConfiguration, which is we're going to get stuff from appsettings.json. But as you notice, so many more places, including user secrets and environmental variables. It also configures the iLogger factory to log to the console, debug, and event source outputs, which we're going to override today. And then it enables scope validation on dependency injection container when the environment name is development. So that's all the things that this does. And if we just do the create default builder, it will do all those things just as is. But we want to add more to this. The first thing I want to add is a place to put all of our dependencies. So .configure services. You want to have two open parens, and we're going to pass in two values here. I'm going to call them context and services. And then we're going to do our arrow and our curly braces. So in here is where we configure all of our services. If you ever created a ASP.NET Core project, you'll have a configure services section. It's the same thing as this. All right. So we're going to put in here any of our services. We don't have any yet, but we're going to create one really soon. So I'll leave it blank for now, but we're going to come back to it. And then after this, I'm going to say use Serilog. That's it, because we've already configured Serilog right up here. So just use it. And then finally, build. Now notice I'm using the ability that C# has to do multiple lines as long as you don't use a semicolon. So I've said, okay, this line, and I have dot, this is all chained together. But because I wanted to be more readable about it, I put it on multiple lines. Just like I did up here with this logger configuration. This is a pretty common thing to do when you have these chained methods. So believe it or not, we're actually done configuring everything for dependency injection, appsettings.json or settings, and for logging. We're done. This right here does everything except for setting up Serilog, which Serilog is extra. If we want to do Serilog, we just want to use the default logger, then that would be all we need is this little section right here. Adding Serilog adds this information and this information. Now let's create a class that we can put into our services and actually call. Remember that with a console application, we call the static void main. We start here and we get to here, the console closes. So we need to, in here, somehow activate a class and call that class to do something. So what I have to do is create one class as my entry point that kind of replaces the static void main, where I have a run method that when it's done running, then my console is done. Let's create that class. I'm going to create it right down here after this curly brace. Now, I do not encourage you to leave classes inside of other files. So don't have multiple classes inside one file. But this is a great place to create a class and then move it. And I'll show you how to do that. So, public class. Let's call this greeting service. All right. And this is going to have a public void run method. And this method, that's what I'm saying, is this method will replace what we'd normally put inside of static void main. And it can do all the calls that it needs. In our case, it's going to be really simple. It's just going to do a for loop. And we'll say I 1 to 10 for right now. We're going to change that in a minute. And we're going to say, hey, I want to print out, this is number, whatever number it is. But I want to log that, not just write it out to the console. I'm going to log it to the console because we're just doing a console logger for now. But this is just to show that we can use logging, right? So how do we get logging in here? And also, that 10 right there seems like it should be a more flexible number, meaning maybe you want to change that over time. Maybe we'll pull that from configuration instead. So let's set up a constructor for this. Wow, we have one too many E's here. For this greeting service. So CTOR, which is a snippet for constructor. That creates this constructor right here, greeting service. I'm going to say I want an iLogger. I want an iLogger of type greeting service. Call it just log. And then also an iConfiguration of type config, or of name config. So iLogger, control dot here to add the using statement. They may say, Tim, why you have a logging type of greeting service? Well, with iLogger, we can pass in the type that it is, and that will send that information on to our logger, so our logger knows what type of class we're getting a call from. Now I need to store these two pieces of information so I can use them. So first log, I'm going to control dot here and create and initialize the field _log. So it creates a private read-only iLogger called _log. Now yours might not call it _log, it might just call it log. Well, the reason for that is because I've made a tweak to my settings. If you go to Tools, Options, and down here under, I believe it is, oh, there it is, Text Editor. For whatever reason, these are not in alphabetical order, which is frustrating. Text Editor, under C#, if you go to, I think it's IntelliSense, nope, Code Style. There we go. Naming. So Code Style Naming. So under Text Editor, C#, Code Style Naming. I have added this line right here, which is unreadable because of the fact that I'm using a larger font size, and so it doesn't grow the boxes with the font size, which is frustrating. But I'll show you what this is. So I've added a new entry for private or internal fields. So I said plus here, Then the first entry is private or internal fields. The required style, I called underscore because it wasn't already in the list. There was Pascal case and begins with I. So I said manage naming styles, and I add a new one with this plus right here. I called it underscore, and the required prefix I said underscore, and then I said down here camel case. So I call this underscore. I put the underscore here. Capitalization is camel case, and there is my sample that shows you exactly what it's going to look like. I hit OK, and then I used that in this style, so underscore. And the severity I said refactoring only. It's not a warning or an error or even a suggestion. I just said refactor only. It's up to you what kind of severity you want to add. So that's now how, when I say control dot, for example, config, create initial as a field, it creates that underscore config for me. So I like that. I have that preference when I'm bringing in information from the dependency injection system. It tells me, okay, don't modify this. It's the same thing I use with private backing fields for properties. Because that way I know, hey, don't modify this private backing field. You go to the front end of the property and you modify it there so you don't, not shortcut in the circuit. So same way here, you don't modify config or log, you use them. So that's what we're going to do. Now, just to be clear, if there was data that was stored inside of log or config, you can still modify that data. It's just you don't want to overwrite this log with a new iLogger, or overwrite this config with a new iConfiguration instance. That's what you don't want to do. Okay, so now we have iLogger and iConfiguration. Now you can come down here and say, you know what? Let's do underscore log dot log information, and we'll create our message. So we are, let's just say run number, like so, and we'll pass in I. There we go. So that's going to create for us our log information. You may say, well, Tim, why did you do string interpolation there? Why don't you put a $sign in front of this and put I there? Well, because in logging, if you have a structured logger, like Serilog is, then what Serilog will do is it will not only log this text, but it will also log this value separately under the variable name run number, so that you can look through your logs and do a query on what does run number 3 look like across all of my instances, versus having to parse string to say, figure out which one is number 3, not number 30, not number 13, just number 3. So doing so this way actually makes a lot more sense for logging purposes. So we're just going to loop through and log all of those numbers. But now let's also change this over to pull from our configuration. So config.getValue of type int, and let's call this loop times. The number of times we're going to loop through this thing, which isn't there yet, but it will be. We go to Solution Explorer, appsettings.json. I'm going to say, in quotes, loop times, and let's start with 5. Okay, so now there's 5 loop times we're going to loop through. Now we have our greeting service done. We're going to call this run method. It's going to loop through this 5 times, hopefully, and be done. Let's, at the end of our static void main, the very end, I'm going to do a console dot. You know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do a console read line because it already pauses for me because of how .NET Core works a little bit differently. So let's not do our console read line at the end. We don't have to do that. But we do need to call this thing. So how do we call it up here in a way that uses our dependency injection system? Well, first, we need to add it to dependency injection. So services, that's not it. Services dot add transient. Transient means give me a new instance every time I ask for it for the greeting service. Now, those of you who are familiar with dependency injection might say, well, Tim, wouldn't you want to do an interface to this? My answer is yes, I probably would. Okay, but in this case, we're just going to do it this way. I hate doing that. I hate doing examples where I say, yeah, don't do it this way in real life. So let's do it right. So first we're going to move this off into its own file. So click on the class name, control dot, move type to greetingservice.cs. It's gone, and now it's over here. Next, I'm going to come up here on the class name and go control dot again and say extract interface. And it says, what do you want to extract? Just the run method. That's the only thing that's public. I hit OK. Cool. So now I have an interface for this. Now I can say iGreetingService and greeting service. That way it's much more realistic to what you'd see in the real world. And the reason why you do this, it may feel like that interface is a waste because it's just mirroring what you have in greeting service, right? Well, not quite, because whenever we reference or ask for a greeting service class, we're going to ask for iGreetingService. And when we do that, we're going to get back greeting service. So what's the benefit? Well, when we're ready to test, we can say, hey, you know what? This other class depends on iGreetingService. We don't want to test that. So we'll pass in a different iGreetingService than greeting service. So it allows us to take away dependencies or change dependencies to be ones that won't write to a database, that won't send emails to customers, that won't make changes to production values. So that's what the interface allows us to do very easily when it comes to testing, is replace those dependencies. So even if you only ever have one implementation of your interface, you'll still be available to have a second implementation, which is for your unit testing. And that's a really good thing. Plus, down the road, if we say, you know what, we have a better greeting service, you create that class, and as long as you implement iGreetingService, you replace it with this one with better greeting service, and nothing else has to change. Your application just gets an upgrade. So really helpful to use the interface. So I encourage it whenever possible to use that interface. Don't just go right to the class. So even though this is a demo, I'm going to do it right. Now that we have that, we still need to figure out how do we get greeting service and start this? How do we kick this thing off? Because we want to do it right so we have the dependency injection system using or working against our greeting service. If we just try to do a new greeting service, we have to pass in iLogger and iConfiguration, which we don't have directly. We could probably get them, but that seems like a lot of work, and it's not how the dependency injection system is supposed to work. So instead, we're going to say var svc for service equals activator utilities dot create instance of iGreeterService for host dot out of host dot services. Notice it says host right here. We're saying, okay, you have created a default builder, you configure the services, you use Serilog, and you did build. That's going to build out our iHost builder. It's going to build it out and put it into host. So now host has everything. It has dependency injection, it has logging, it has our appsettings.json. So use that and say, hey, you got a whole bunch of services, your dependency injection container. In those, I want you to find or create an instance of iGreetingService. And it goes and says, okay, I got these services. One of them is iGreetingService. I'll give you a greeting service instance. Now that's in this service. So this service is an iGreeting service. So we can say svc.run. And what does that do? It's going to run this right here. And it's going to call this loop. It's going to loop through however many times you specified in the appsettings.json file, and we can go from there. So we're almost there. We're almost ready, but there's one more thing we have to do, and it comes back to Serilog. In appsettings.json, we promised Serilog that we're going to put some configuration in here to tell it how to work. So let's do that. So I put a comma after my 5, and I say Serilog. And I put my open, close curly braces. And we're going to say minimum level. This is going to set our minimum levels. The default is going to be information. Oops. But we're going to override this. And this comes right from Serilog as kind of like the place to start. So you're going to override for Microsoft to say information. And for system, we're going to say warning. Now this comes right from Serilog, like I said. And I wanted to put it in here this way just to talk you through what are some of the basic options. Now I have a whole video on Serilog. We're not going to go too deep into that, but I do want you to know how this works at a high level. Like I said, you can go watch the Serilog video if you want a more in-depth view. But it's saying the minimum level for logging is going to be, by default, information. So if you say log.log information, that's going to get printed out to the console, which is the only sync we added. But if we're going to override this default value for certain namespaces, so the namespace is Microsoft.something, then information is the override. You may say, well, that's redundant. Well, yeah, but if we change the default to warning up here, it would still be information down here. So Microsoft at the information level, but for anything that comes from system, we're going to say it has to be the warning level or higher. Because some of the .NET stuff can be rather chatty when it comes to telling you all the things it's doing for you. And if you're not careful, you will overload your logs with information you never wanted to get. And this is something that I want to take a quick minute to talk about when it comes to logging. When you first get into logging, you think, I'm going to log everything. Don't do that. Because what happens is you end up filling up your logs so full that you, first of all, create a problem with your logs. You have to figure out what to do with them. And second of all, you never read them. If you're not going to read or act upon your logs, then don't save them. There's no point to them. In fact, they're hurting you. So only save information you're going to read and act upon. Now that read may be as simple as a chart that tells you how often you have this certain activity happen. That's fine. You don't have to, read every physical line one by one. But if you're not going to use the information, don't store it. So this allows you to change this at runtime. Remember that we said that when we did this manually, talking to the appsettings.json, in here we said, right down here, reload on change is true. So whenever you change the appsettings.json file, reload it in the application. That's because you can be allowed to, we want to encourage you to make changes to this file as necessary. So what I do is I keep my log files usually on at least warning, if not error, and higher. And so it only logs the errors, the things that are a big deal. And then if I find that there's a machine that has a problem, or a website that has a problem, or something like that, some kind of app that has a problem, I set the logging levels to be, let's say, information or higher. And then I get a lot more information, but in a short amount of time, because I want to know more context about what's going on. That's when I set to information. So that's just a little note there. Don't always just set your logging to be everything. Okay, so now we have this logging set up. This is going to be logging. Let's go to the greeting service. This is logging information level. Let's run this application for the very first time. Make sure nothing blows up. It didn't blow up. Okay, it says application starting, and then it goes, uh-oh, we've got a problem. Okay, so this was my bad, but let's talk through this because it's a great time to talk through what happens when stuff blows up. And this is often a thing I get in my email inbox or in a YouTube comment where people say, hey, this is not working. Here's the error message, which, first of all, thank you for providing the error message, because the error message is really helpful. And so when you provide that, it helps me diagnose the problem. But I do want you to take a minute and see if you can read through the error message and understand what it's saying. Because often, very often, the error message tells you exactly what the problem is. So this is an unhandled exception. It may sound scary. System invalid operation exception. This will not tell you a whole lot, but this message will. A suitable constructor for type iGreetingService could not be located. Now wait for a minute. A suitable constructor for iGreetingService. Do interfaces have constructors? The answer is no. So yeah, you're not going to be able to find a constructor for iGreetingService. I didn't want you to. I wanted you to find a constructor for GreetingService, which should be what iGreetingService is the type of it. Okay? So ensure the type is concrete. What does a concrete type mean? It means an actual class instance, not an interface. And services are registered for all parameters of a public constructor. So you have to have a concrete type, and all the services that concrete type's constructor asks for need to be registered. All right, so this is because I said iGreetingService instead of GreetingService. Now, normally, when you ask for dependency injection to give you an instance, you want to use the interface. But in this special case, where we're starting off the application, we ask for the actual concrete type, which is what it will start off things with, but it will still use the services to populate the constructor for things like iLogger and for iConfiguration. So that's my bad, but normally you'd ask for an iGreetingService, but just not in this activator case. Let's run this again. All right, so not quite what I had expected, but we're getting closer. So you know what the error is yet? Well, the error is actually in my spacing. I like to have spacing around things, but you can't do that when you do a structured log. Let's try this one more time. And this time we should see a run number. Notice the color changes. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all in this purple color. That means this is actually an object. It's not just part of the string, it's an object. Okay? So we got application starting, and then we've got run number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's logging 5 total runs from 0 to 4. If I go to my appsettings.json file and change that to 15, and I run this again, this time I have 0 through 14. Now what if I go to my appsettings.json file and say, you know what? I want this to be warning or higher by default. Well, if you run this now, it seems like nothing happened. We're just waiting here to close the application. That's because none of our messages rated that high. If we change this to log.error, then we'll see that our messages do show up because they're errors, which isn't quite right. They're informational, but that just shows you how to make sure that you limit your logging to only certain log statements. So now we've seen in program.cs, this right here, this is setting up everything to do with dependency injection. That's right here. Logging, which is either by default or if we change over to Serilog, and our appsettings.json, which we haven't changed at all. So this right here sets up all three of the things that we're looking for. Now we added on the ability to do the configuration here and the configuration right here for Serilog. And by doing so, we really elevated our logging game for our console application. This does seem like a lot of code for a console application. However, if you look at this and you say, you know what, all of this is pretty much just boilerplate. This is just the standard setup, which it really is. You can copy all of this information and paste it into your next console application and be ready to go in about 15 seconds. Or you could create your own project template and then just make this the starting point for your next application. And then you just modify things like what your appsettings.json is going to have in it. Okay? So you can really take this to the next level and be very quick about how this is all set up. Okay? So that's how to take your console application to the next level, to add dependency injection, to add logging, and to add your appsettings.json configuration to it. All right, so it kind of brings this up to the same level as an ASP.NET Core application. All right, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, if you think about things you want to see differently or change, maybe you want to see how we do this in WinForms or WPF in the .NET Core world, let me know in the comments. I'd love to interact with you on that and put it on a list of things that you're looking for, and then maybe one day you'll see a video based upon your suggestion. All right, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. I appreciate it. And as always, I am Tim Corey.